Welcome into the PFF podcast. Steve Palazzolo here, making my return after a couple weeks off, joined by Sam Monson, and we're just enjoying the summer, Sam, having some fun. We're going to do a little mail bag, Twitter bag today. Is that what we're doing? Answering some questions?
Twitter bag? That can't be a thing, surely.
Well, I don't have a mail bag. Do you have a mail bag? Where'd you get this mail?
No, but that's what it is. It's a mail bag. It's like a Twitter bag isn't a thing. That doesn't exist.
Well, it should be a thing. We need a Twitter
the mail bag.
Something that has all of our questions.
Metaphor. Yes.
All right.
So let's do questions. We're going to answer them. That's what it is.
We had some decent questions out there. Again, it's summertime. We've got camps, starting next week. And it's time to just kind of, get ready for the season. I think it's about time. Is it time for the preseason? I think we're ready. But we'll get through one more week of off-season fodder. You want to start with some of the questions that got fired our way over on Twitter?
Yeah, let's do it. One of the first ones I think that came in was a pretty good question actually about Ty Montgomery and whether he's actually a good receiver as a running back, as opposed to just you assume that once you stick a wide receiver back there, he's going to be a good receiver because that's what he was doing. But obviously running backs have a completely different route tree than wide receivers do. They're running different things. It's a different job. You're still catching the ball, but it's a completely different role. So is Ty Montgomery actually good at that? And what are the differences between the two positions? And if there's no difference, why wouldn't all teams just stick a wide receiver in the backfield? So there's a lot to that, but I think it's worth getting into that.
Well, yeah, you're right. There's a slightly different route tree. And it's just like different angles and stuff like that. When you run a flat route out of the backfield, a lot of times, like fullbacks have done it for years, that just, straight to the flat, and it looks like an easy pitch and catch, but those are tough angles for quarterbacks, tough angles for receivers. So it is a little bit different. I think the bigger picture here, the reason why you don't just put any wide receiver in the backfield, it's that ability, it's because he can be a good running back that makes things so dangerous. So while this isn't necessarily talking about how difficult his job is, I'm going to talk about how difficult that is on the defense. When you have a guy that can actually take a handoff or line up out wide, it really does put a lot of pressure on the defense because you don't know what the formation is going to be ahead of time. You're simply matching up, hey, Ty Montgomery's on the field, and when you see him on the field, before you see the formation, you have to determine, do I need a linebacker in the game because of Ty Montgomery? Do I need an extra safety? Am I running nickel? Am I running base? And then if he lines up out wide, he might be on your linebacker creating a mismatch. Or if you have a cornerback matching up with him, you essentially treat him like a wide receiver, and he's in the backfield. All of a sudden, you have an extra corner on the field trying to stop the run. I think that's the biggest mismatch opportunity when you have a guy like Ty Montgomery that can actually run the ball as a running back, run routes out of the backfield as a running back and as a receiver.
Yeah, that's the big thing that he brings in terms of why he's a real X factor. I mean, the real reason you can't just put a wide receiver in the backfield is because then teams know that it's a pass play. There's no way that guy is running the ball between the tackles. And B, pass protection. If you need the running back to stay in and pick up a blitz, you don't want a guy that weighs 180 pounds trying to do that. And especially you don't want a guy who you actually have serious investment in as a wide receiver. So, you're not going to put Julio Jones in the backfield and ask him to pick up a linebacker because if he gets run over and dismantled, you've suddenly lost your best receiving option. So, Montgomery was always a wide receiver in a running back's body. And to be honest, he was just a running back that was playing wide receiver. So he has the size to be able to play in the backfield, run between the tackles if you need him to, on those plays that look like passing downs but are actually going to be handoffs. And B, he can put his face in there and pick up a linebacker if you need him to. That's not a problem. But looking last year at his production on targets, on receptions that were running back routes, he was obviously 10 for 11 on screens. You expect a running back to catch pretty much everything that's catchable for a screen. They went for an average of 7.4 yards, 11 of which came after the catch. So obviously he's catching the ball behind the line of scrimmage on a screen, gaining essentially 11 yards after the catch every time. Forced a couple of missed tackles in there. He caught a couple of pivot routes that went for an average of 7, broke a tackle there. and he caught 7 flare routes out of the backfield, and those again went for an average of 7.7 with almost 10 yards coming after the catch. So far, everything we've seen from him, he's been a good receiver out of the backfield. And like you said, he brings that extra dimension of being a matchup problem for teams.
I like it, and especially for an offense like Green Bay, who I think, Aaron Rodgers was not himself early last season. He wasn't terrible. He just wasn't himself. And they do get a little vanilla on offense. It's a lot of, they do get into this rut sometimes of just a bunch of, isolation routes by the receivers, or just run a slant, just beat your man. And if those guys aren't beating their man, it's very tough to complete passes, even if you are Aaron Rodgers. So that added dimension that Ty Montgomery brings, makes them all the more dangerous. Another question that we had 2 questions about Oakland. I think we could kind of roll them into one, essentially asking about Oakland's secondary and what they've done and how they're going to match up with opposing teams. And then someone asked about Derek Carr taking another step forward. How good can that offense be? Can they match their 12 wins from a year ago? I think we can hit both sides of this, starting with the Oakland secondary. Any thoughts on offseason moves? They draft Garyon Conley in the first round. Comes with a little bit of controversy after he had his pre-draft on or off-field incident. They still have David Amerson. They still have Sean Smith, guys that they brought in over the last couple of years. Carl Joseph is heading into year 2 after being their first-round pick in 2016, and then Reggie Nelson returns for his second year. And then in the second round, Obi Melifonwu, one of my favorite players from the draft, mostly just pronouncing his name. That's the most fun. Obi Melifonwu, UConn safety, 6'4", 220 plus. They add him in the second round. So Oakland has added a ton of resources to the secondary over the last couple of years. How do you see this one shaken out this year?
Yeah, it looks really good on paper in terms of potential. But I suspect because so much of that is potential, they're going to be at least a year away from being a really good unit. But I think the 2018 Oakland Raiders secondary could be something really impressive. Carl Joseph looked like a fantastic player coming out. I think he showed enough as a rookie to suggest that year 2 he'll take a big step forward. If Conley and Obi Melifonwu are the guys that we think they are, again, it's going to be year 2 before we really see what they can bring. And then it's a case of whether Reggie Nelson, Sean Smith, or David Amerson, whichever of those are still there, can kind of hang on long enough to complete the unit, to make those, to be the veteran presence around those really young guys. Or there's the worry that they might not quite all hit their stride at the same time, and it might not be as good a unit as it could be if they did. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. You've got to love the moves that they made. And Obi Melifonwu has the kind of the capability to almost be a defensive Ty Montgomery in terms of a matchup player, a guy that can cover tight ends with that kind of size, or a guy that can actually play as a true cornerback and cover wide receivers. So that's the way the NFL is going with these kind of joker matchup problem players on both offense and defense, and the Raiders seem to have got one there.
Yeah, Melifonwu is similar, actually, I think, to fellow UConn product Byron Jones, who's carved out a really nice niche for himself on the Dallas defense. Playing safety, covering tight ends, he can dabble covering wide receivers. Melifonwu was at the Senior Bowl, and they were trying him at cornerback. A lot of teams were actually looking at him as a corner because of his 6'4" frame, and he was running down the field. I mean, he tested unbelievably as far as his athleticism goes, and he was, covering receivers down the field. So from a matchup standpoint, I think it looks great. I mean, I was a little disappointed in David Amerson and Sean Smith last year. Amerson, maybe we shouldn't have been disappointed. He's a guy was pretty much just below average in Washington, had a breakout 2015 season, and kind of regressed a little bit more to what he was before. He was up and down last season, had some really good games, had some poor games, and then Sean Smith, a similar up and down season. But those guys bring really good size on the outside, and I think when you have in the NFL today, you want teams that want to play a lot of man coverage. You want to get different types of cornerbacks to match up with opposing offenses. So when you have a guy like Sean Smith who's 6'3", can maybe line up against some of those bigger wide receivers. Amerson has that ability as well. You talk about Carl Joseph, who brings a little bit of versatility. He's not just a safety. He can play short zone. He can cover some tight ends. And then Obi, who can cover tight ends or receivers. And Reggie Nelson, who's really one of the more underrated, deep safeties. Not pure center fielder, but, half safety and everything. So, again, I'm with you. On paper, it looks really good. Throw in Gary and Conley, who we mentioned, who was an excellent man corner at Ohio State, could play off coverage as well. On paper, there's a lot of names, but I think the angle you took might be the right one as far as Amerson and Smith. Unless they have huge seasons and bounce-back seasons next year, it might not match up perfectly with all these guys hitting their stride at the same time.
Yeah, I like this question, though, because this is getting into the area that the real nitty-gritty of the 0 to 100 grades, which is obviously what everyone loves. How can a guy who gets, say, 3 individual game grades of 85 end up with an overall season grade that's higher than that? How does that mathematically work?
Well, we have to get the mathematics people over here to help us out. But
that's
the basic gist of it is they're on different scales. So, so let's use J.J. Watt as an example, because J.J. Watt, when we were working on this 0 to 100 scale, was the center of the whole thing. How do we make sure that J.J. Watt doesn't break this whole thing? He's had games that are in our old plus-minus system, where a game of like +5 was good, he would have like a +15. And that would essentially break the scale. So what happens is on a game level, the sample size, the game level grades need to be much wider. So a 99 game level grade needs to be absolutely spectacular, and spectacular to the point where you almost can't even sustain it. So if you play a 99 game, that's like J.J. Watt picking up 12 pressures in a game and 5 run stops and forcing a fumble. That's like domination. Same thing, what was it, Brent Grimes last year, week 17, he had about 4 pass breakups, a couple tackles for short gains, had a pick 6, about as productive a game as you'll see from a cornerback, and he was close to a 98 or 99. Those are games that are just pretty much impossible to sustain. If Brent Grimes did that every week, obviously, he'd have 16 interceptions, all for touchdowns, and 64 pass breakups. So a 99 game is pretty much impossible to have. So now you back that down a little bit. So an 85 game is really, really, really good. And if you sustain an 85 game throughout the season, you're probably having a spectacular season, a Hall of Fame worthy type season. So again, they're on different scales. So because an individual game is essentially a smaller sample size, you need a wider range that allows guys to get up to that 96, 97, 98 type of mark. But an 85 game grade is really, really good. And when you talk about a season, a bunch of 80 games, we know that those are really, really good, and that sustained success kind of stacks up to being a really good season. Does that all make sense? Did that cover it a little bit without getting into too much of the math?
Yeah, I think that was pretty good. I think the one other thing that you kind of flirted with there, never quite got into, is it's harder to play at a specifically high level for 16 games than it is to get there once or twice. So if you get a guy that has, an 85 game, that's all well and good. But if he does that 6-7 times in a row, that's much better than doing it once. So you get a little bit of a bump for achieving that same level over and over again. So like you said, the question, in theory, you can get 385 games, but because you're hitting that level more and more, that's actually better. So you end up with a season grade that's higher than the 3 grades that went into it, because you're getting that little bump for essentially repeating the same impressive performance that you got in each one of those individual games.
Yeah, so that's a good way of putting it. And here's another way of putting it too. Yeah, that 85, if playing 6 straight games of 85, game level grading is not 85 play, so to speak. It's just like if you throw for, let's just use basic stats. If you throw for 300 yards, any quarterback can throw for 300 yards. And you say, okay, that's a good game. But if you throw for 300 yards in 8 straight games, now you're talking about a guy that's having an elite season, if we were just using yards as an example and pretending that was a good stat to use. Okay, so one game of 300 yards is good. 8 games of 300 yards is an outstanding season. So again, it's almost like just having two different scales. But it's a great question and one that we do see on Twitter quite a bit. What else do we have here, Sam?
Somebody asked a simple one that is a good one to just fire through, which is the top 5 players to miss tackles last year, or I guess the 5 players with the most missed tackles last year, which I looked into. And usually there's a bit of a mix between linebacker and safeties. But this year, 2016 anyway, it was all linebackers. And actually there's a trend in the kind of linebacker it was. So, let's go 5-1 actually, although it's 6 because 2 players tied for 5th with 20 missed tackles each, Kevin Minter and Derek Johnson. 21 missed tackles, Ryan Shazier from Pittsburgh. 22 missed tackles, Quan Alexander from Tampa Bay. 27 missed tackles was Telvin Smith, and 27 missed tackles also was Alec Ogletree.
Athletic linebackers, man.
There you go.
It's all those athletic linebackers. You're right. It is. There's similar similar types of players. The NFL these days is trying to get a little bit smaller, a little bit quicker, more athletic. I think one of my biggest issues is that when you're scouting linebackers, which is one of the toughest positions, I think, to scout and to project, even when talking to other NFL coaches that have been around for years, they're just like, look, linebackers are just difficult sometimes. But I think you need this kind of like baseline of athleticism, which all these guys, they fly to the ball. Shazier, Quan, Telvin, Ogletree, they just have great athleticism. But athleticism doesn't always translate to good play on the field. If you're missing tackles or if you're just not good in coverage, athleticism doesn't mean you're going to be a good coverage player necessarily. Like, I think Shazier shows that quite a bit. He gives up a lot in coverage and gets beaten man coverage quite a bit. But, missing tackles and, just because a guy's fast doesn't mean he's going to be a great player. So I think that is kind of the trend. It's almost better sometimes to have the guy that may be a step slower, but is going to, finish plays and not leave, 20 missed tackles on the field in a given year, because those can lead to some big plays.
Yeah, just looking, the highest graded player of that group last year was Telvin Smith, who was tied for the 19th best graded linebacker with a grade of 83.0. So everyone else was lower than that in some way or shape or form.
Yeah, and it's fair to say that not every missed tackle is bad, and our grading will reflect that, right? There's a difference between maybe missing a guy one-on-one in the open field versus, shedding a block, getting into the backfield and missing a tackle. A lot of times that'll go down as a positive grade, even though a guy missed the tackle. He did a good job of actually getting into the backfield, something that most linebackers wouldn't even do on that play. So the grading will always kind of trump the stats, but I think the stats, they tell a story. They tell a story about these players. Somebody asked about interception percentage under pressure. If you guys are following the PFF Twitter account, we are just firing graphics out every single day with some cool stats and some cool visuals. A lot of times we talk about quarterbacks, how they play under pressure versus when they play from a clean pocket. But somebody asked, does any quarterback have an interception percentage, or have they had an interception percentage that is actually better under pressure than it was from a clean pocket? And again, talking about from just a season standpoint, that does happen, and it just happened last season. You have Matt Ryan, the MVP of the league, did not throw an interception. He threw went under pressure. He threw 7 total on the season, and he didn't throw an interception when under pressure. Aaron Rodgers actually had a 12-1 touchdown to interception ratio when under pressure. So only 1 interception. I think he had 8 maybe on the season. So yeah, it does happen. Over time Rodgers had 7 on the season, but over time it'll generally skew toward interception percentage will be worse under pressure, and that was one of the graphics that we tweeted this week. But there are guys in those small season sample sizes that can trump it.
Yeah, there's also, I think Aaron Rodgers or Roethlisberger is the only guy that's gone through a season and actually had a better passer rating when under pressure than when not under pressure. I can't remember what year that was, but I think one of those two guys, I think, is the only guy that's done that over a full season. It's almost impossible to do. Typically, getting pressured will torpedo your passer rating to the tune of like 35 points. But one of those guys, I think, was able to do it for a whole year where they ended up better.
Yeah, that's one of those things that we tout all the time at PFF, is that pressure does matter, and it's not just all about sacks.
There you go. That's a beautiful segue. Yeah, there you go. Beautiful segue.
Right?
We're pros at this. Look at this. So we posted a thing today we posted actually both ends of this, where we looked at overall pass rushing productivity against sack percentage, or sort of a conversion rate, if you like, of what kind of pressure you're getting and how often you're actually getting home. And we posted Vic Beasley and Marcus Golden on one end of things, who had a really high percentage of their total pressure get home for sacks. And then the other end of the scale was Brandon Graham and Chris Jones, in terms of guys who had a really low percentage of their total pressure end up in sacks. And the theory being that the guys that had the low percentage are primed to get a higher number of sacks next year than they did this year. And the guys with a really high percentage are primed for regression. So while we might think of Vic Beasley as a really young player who just had a huge number of sacks in a breakout season, you'd expect him to take another step forward next year. Actually, the numbers suggested the opposite is going to happen, because he was so much higher than the league average in terms of the kind of the finishing percentage of his total pressure that came in sacks. It's just unlikely to happen again unless he dramatically improves the volume of pressure. So somebody asked, have there been guys over the past decade of grading that have managed to buck that trend long term and have managed to sustain a really higher level of sack percentage compared with the average? The average last year, I haven't actually run the numbers for 10 years, but the overall average last year was, I think, 15.5% in terms of what the average edge rusher converts the total pressures into sacks. There are guys, though, in PFF's history that have been significantly higher than that over an extended period of time. And actually, there's some interesting names. So Sean Merriman, I think we had 5 seasons worth of Merriman's play, had a sack percentage of 24.3%, which is Vic Beasley this year is, I think, at 28 point something. So it's not quite at the unsustainable regression candidate level, but it's pretty damn high, 10% higher than the average last year.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I'm surprised about Merriman, too, because he really played that traditional old school 3-4 outside linebacker position, which traditionally does pick up some cheap pressures, some unblocked pressures because of bootlegs and things like that, a little bit more than defensive end. So sustaining that type of rate is actually all the more impressive given the position he played.
Well, he just had a phenomenal run of a few seasons. I mean, the numbers that we have him for, 37 sacks, 25 hits, 90 hurries, which is a pretty ridiculous rate through, 5 seasons worth. Joey Porter, actually, another one that had a ridiculous percentage of his pressure that was sacks, 25.5, which again is even higher than Merriman, getting right up into that unsustainable level.
Another and was one of the big outside backer.
Yeah, and was one of the big reasons we were calling for Cameron Wake to get snaps over him late in his career, because he had that 15 sack season in Miami, but it was almost all of his pressure. I mean, he just somehow contrived to get home with virtually every pressure he got in that season, whereas Cameron Wake was generating pressure at a ridiculous rate, a much higher rate than Porter. And we were saying, look, this guy may have had 15 sacks, but actually the guy he's keeping on the bench may be a far better pass rusher.
Yeah, Wake was one of our favorite breakout candidates. One of the guys that was so productive in a short sample size, a small sample size, that we said, look, give this guy more snaps and he's going to be a really good player, and made us look good. He was one of those guys. What year was that? 2009 when Wake broke out like that?
Could be. Good question.
Should know this stuff coming in.
I'm going to give you 5 names that we have 10 seasons worth of data on that all had higher than the average percentage in terms of sack rate.
All right.
Elvis Dumervil, sack rate of 21.9% over his 10 seasons.
Pretty good. He's known as a sack artist. Keeps getting jobs as a designated pass rusher.
Here's another one. Robert Mathis, 21.8, right behind Doom.
All those strip sacks.
DeMarcus Ware, a little bit further behind, but 20.7.
And he created a ton of pressure, too. That's the thing about him and Mathis. They created a ton of pressure, too. It wasn't that they just happened to run into a lot of sacks. They were getting after the QB.
DeMarcus Ware has one extra season than these guys on file, and he has 431 total pressures, which is it's 100 more pressures than either of those two guys we just mentioned.
Wow. Yeah, and he always graded extremely well in our system.
James Harrison next up, 19.9%. 265 total pressures over the past 10 seasons we have.
Still going.
Yeah. It's good workout videos. Those are keeping them going. And the last one, Terrell Suggs, 19.3%, 10 seasons worth, 306 total pressures over that time.
So it's actually a lot of those 3-4 outside backer types. I guess maybe I was wrong on that being a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, no, a lot of these guys seem to be. There are some 4-3 guys in there. Robert Quinn is up there with a pretty high. Lawrence Jackson, weirdly. Well, not weirdly, interestingly. Let's give the guy some credit.
Good job, Lawrence.
Jason Taylor, I think, bounced between the two, didn't he? He was both a defensive end and an outside linebacker at times.
Yeah, I think, especially when Saban was there in 2006, I think they tried to stand him up, make him that pure 3-4 backer type. Yep.
Justin Tuck is up there, Jared Allen, Cameron Wake. So there's some guys that have done both.
That's great. Good job. You're getting really good with this Excel thing.
Yeah. Well, no, Ben did that for me.
Oh,
I did some other Excel stuff, though. It's all right. No, I can keep the credit. I did some Excel things today.
Well, I'm proud of you, Sam. You're not.
Thanks.
We used to make fun of your Excel work, and it's become quite good over the years.
There you go.
We had a question about, and I know you and Mike touched on this week on the other podcast, which I suggest you check out. Check out the entire PFF archive, including the history of PFF, which we enjoyed this summer, and our little tutorial on how PFF grades pass game, run game. Sam and I went through a bunch of old games and seasons, or that just didn't match up, grades and stats. So go check out all that stuff. But you guys talked about Seattle's cover 3, and has it run its course? Give me the Cliff Notes version on what you guys were talking about. The question was about Seattle's cover 3. Does it have a short lifespan, the same way Tampa 2 became in vogue and every team starts running it? What are your thoughts on Seattle's cover 3? Will the league figure it out? Is it all about the players? Everybody seems to be copying this. We now have Atlanta essentially running it, Jacksonville's running it, San Diego's running it, and San Francisco's going to be running it this year, at least a version of this Seattle cover 3. What are your thoughts on this in vogue scheme right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually touched on this exact topic on the last podcast. We went through when we compared it to the Tampa 2. We discussed whether it was, the Tampa 2 used to be the system that everybody was running, and then suddenly it started to get figured out, and now you basically don't see it as a base defense. You see people run it as part of their coverage, but you don't see anybody run that as their entire system. And what we were saying is, it might be a case of these things last for long enough in the league as a go-to system until the coaching tree from that particular successful system disseminates far enough around the league that the guys you're coaching against have experience with the system and know where the pressure points are. And we were talking about how Seattle in particular seem to be having more and more trouble these days with busted coverages and being caught out by kind of uncoverable plays in terms of the way we're set up and the rules we have on defense. That is open. What we're doing right now, it's nobody's fault. It's just that is open against this particular defensive call. And in particular, we talked about how that happened when they went up against the Falcons. They conspired to basically leave Levine Toilolo. I think I added the extra syllable in there this time. Completely uncovered for a touchdown. So it might be the case that now with that Seattle coaching tree taking that defense throughout the league, you mentioned Atlanta and Jacksonville, we're going to start to see it become less successful than it was in the past.
So I think a lot of it still, you're focused on the coaches and the scheme. I think a lot of it still has to come down to the players. I mean, since we've been doing analysis for PFF, every week we have a handful of plays where we have to figure out who busted this coverage. There's a handful of plays. How many of them, Sam, are just a crossing route against cover 3? And if a guy makes a good play on a crossing route against cover 3, we're like, all right, put him in the Hall of Fame. This just doesn't happen in the NFL. It is the cover 3 coverage beater. But I think the difference with Seattle, they face cover 3 beaters every week. Cover 3 beaters are like the first day of install for teams because it's just the most basic coverage in theory. But Seattle does the best job of not getting beat by routes that are supposed to beat their coverage. Now, you've pulled out a few examples. There's always that wheel route or that second man through the zone that will get them sometimes. But they do such a much better job than Jacksonville has the last few years, than even Atlanta has, even though Atlanta's starting to get better and add speed there. But I just think when you look at, you have Richard Sherman on the outside and what he's able to do. Of course, Earl Thomas playing that free safety role. You need to have a guy that has incredible range to make this thing work. Cam Chancellor is the prototype strong safety for that scheme. We saw Keanu O'Neal have an excellent season in that role last year for Atlanta. And then Bobby Wagner, maybe the unsung hero of this whole thing, because we saw Atlanta try to run this thing with Paul Warlow. You mentioned Telvin Smith. There's Paul Posluszny. Those guys have had their ups and downs trying to run this scheme at linebacker, but Bobby Wagner takes away that deep crossing route, has great range and instincts in the middle of the field. So I still think a lot of it comes down to players. And I'm reminded a little bit of kind of college football, and the spread offense was like the thing, right? Back in the middle 2000s, late 2000s, so 2007, 8, 9, you saw every team's like, all right, we're just going to run zone read all the time. And what you got was like, Rich Rodriguez going to Michigan with a statue for a quarterback trying to run zone read just because it happened to be his offense. So you had bad players running the new in vogue scheme. So it's not as simple as like, let's just run Seattle's cover 3 and everything's going to be okay. I think it still comes down to having those pieces, those components, and that's still what makes Seattle special here. You could say the same thing about Tampa Bay back in the day, right? Warren Sapp was the prototype. Derek Brooks was the prototype. Rondé Barber was the prototype for their respective positions.
Yeah, I think you're always going to have bad versions of a good defensive scheme. When Tampa Bay was winning a Super Bowl with that defense, there were other teams out there running Tampa 2 that didn't have good defenses. That was, look, the Colts ran Tampa 2 for years, and it was terrible because they just didn't have anybody, basically, except for a couple of guys rushing the passer up front, that were capable of playing defense. So, Seattle is the kind of the pinnacle of this defensive scheme, and so far neither Atlanta or Jacksonville have been able to get to that level, and they've been running kind of poor imitations. But I think what's interesting is Tampa Bay does show you that it's not all about the personnel, because the league is probably better or never been better positioned to spit out a set of Tampa 2 prototype players than it is right now. The entire linebacking core of the league, like you said, with those guys that missed all the tackles, is trending towards Derek Brooks style, small, fast coverage linebackers. There's more of those now than there have ever been. Again, the league is stocked full of pass rushers, elite speed guys on the edge. I think now you could create a far better Tampa 2 defense from league personnel than Tampa Bay had in 2002, but teams wouldn't run it now because teams know how to attack a Tampa 2. And I think you're getting to the point where teams understand how to attack this Seattle defense a bit better. What is interesting, though, and a question I don't really have the answer to because we weren't grading then, let alone recording this data, but I don't know how much a Tampa 2 team in 2002 actually ran Tampa 2. Were they running that on 80-90% of their defensive snaps?
That's
or
what
is
we
it
make
like
it seem
now,
like when we say, this team just runs Tampa 2 like it's the only thing that they ever run.
And it may have been the case 15 years ago, whereas now it isn't. Seattle, everyone says, is just a cover 3 team. Seattle ran cover 3 on 54% of their snaps last year, which was the most in the league. But they also ran pure man coverage on more than a third of their snaps, 36.5%. So the most cover 3 team in the league was running man coverage on more than a third of their defensive snaps and only barely over 50% in terms of cover 3. They run a whole bunch of other stuff, and that's why this defense has always been way better than what you would expect from a team that just runs a simple cover 3 scheme, because there's always been far more to it about that. But I don't know if you go back 15 years where, the game was simpler. There was a lot less to it back in the early 2000s than there is now. Whether a team like Tampa Bay was running Tampa 2 80% of the time. It's entirely possible, and that's why that's why that became exposed much more readily, whereas this Seahawks defense or this Seahawks scheme might have a bit more life in it because they do more things. They're not, even if you figure out the cover 3 aspect of it, they do a bunch more other things as well.
The rules have also made it so much easier to pass, and I think part of that Tampa scheme is, you've got the 5-yard contact rule, and you could probably get away with, bringing it to 6, 7, 8 yards of contact back then if they were, because they weren't so focused on illegal contact. Once they really changed that rule, cornerbacks at 5 yards, boom, take your hands off the receiver, then they've got a free run into the cover 2 hole. You can widen the hole and open up other parts of the scheme. If you look at Peyton Manning early in his career, he struggled mightily against cover 2. There were a ton of just misreads. They're throwing to Ty Law, throwing to all these other cornerbacks. He would just misread the coverage a lot until the league kind of eased up a little bit on some of the contact rules. So I think that's a part of it as well. The respected Madman asked that question. He had another one for us on Twitter. How translatable are your college grades to NFL grades? Which is a good question, and one we're still looking into. We've got only 3 years of college data and only 2 years of seeing guys go from college to the NFL. And even those guys, one of the classes we only had their senior year, one of the classes we had their last 2 years of college, essentially. So we're still in our infancy as far as figuring out exactly what those things mean. But I think the early returns, the answer would be it depends on the position. I think some positions have translated beautifully, mostly in the trenches. And again, I think that's something that we pull out pretty well with the PFF grades. So defensive linemen, guys that essentially really dominated in college, that were at the top end of our grades, have generally translated in the NFL. That's whether it's Leonard Williams with the Jets, and then even unheralded, or whether it's Grady Jarrett with the Falcons. Grady Jarrett, Trey Flowers of the New England Patriots, and then Henry Anderson of the Colts, though he did battle injury last year. Those are kind of like our 3 PFF children, Sam. Those are the guys that really crushed our system. The NFL was a little bit lower on those guys, but when they've had a chance to play in the NFL, have been excellent players, guys that we touted as first-round players. And to be honest, I think they've played like first to second-round players when they've all been healthy. So like Grady Jarrett, Trey Flowers, Henry Anderson. So I think the early returns are, if you're a defensive lineman and you crush our system, you're going to be pretty good in the NFL. The other guy last year that made us look good too was Chris Jones of the Kansas City Chiefs, a guy that we had as a top 15 player coming out of the draft, went in the second round to the Chiefs and played like one of the top 10 to 15 players in the draft last year. The other thing I think we've noticed is if you're really bad in our system, like really, really bad, that's Willie Beavers bad, that's Jeremiah Putasi bad. These are both offensive linemen. Putasi was drafted, I believe, in the 3rd round by the Tennessee Titans, was cut within a year and a half, and then Willie Beavers was cut out of training camp as a 4th-round pick. Those guys were like 200th in the nation in our grading. Willie Beavers was, I think it was 314 out of 315. He was the 314th ranked offensive tackle in the nation while playing in the MAC. So, look, it's not about a linear system. If you grade this in college, it's going to be exactly this in the NFL. But right now what we're seeing is at the extreme levels, we're seeing really good translation. And then for other positions, we're diving deeper into the data and saying, look, Dak Prescott didn't really crush our system in college, but there were elements of his game that we probably need to focus on more in future prospects because there was something there. So data is not all about, does this grade directly translate to the NFL? We have 180 fields of data to kind of sort through and sift through and figure out what the most important parts of the data are for each position. So early returns, feeling pretty good about it. Other positions, we have to dig a little bit deeper and figure out, so we know exactly what we're looking for as far as projecting players from college to the NFL.
Not just that, but there's so much confirmation bias at work here and things you have to kind of combat against in terms of trying to figure out what these things mean at the NFL level. So you've got, if the NFL is inherently lower on a player than we were coming out, he may never get the chance to prove different, so you're going to get, and what does that go down as? Is that a swing and a miss from the PFF grading, or is that an inconclusive because you just never saw the field to prove one way or the other? obviously the NFL didn't deem him worth seeing the field, but then the NFL didn't like him to begin with. So there's a lot of players like that where you end up not actually knowing one way or the other who was right.
Yeah, there's also a lot of just what a guy's asked to do, and this is, all scouting or projection in general. Keanu Neal's a good example. He went from Florida, where he played some free safety, played some strong safety, did a little bit of everything. He goes to Atlanta in a simplified strong safety role. We mentioned it earlier, the Cam Chancellor role in that cover 3, cover 1 scheme. He was excellent at it in that 1 year. Big hits, forcing fumbles. He still showed some of what he showed in college, some of the missed tackles and over pursuit. But overall, he went to a scheme that really played to his strength. So I would also say some of our translation, safeties are always difficult. Linebackers are difficult, as I mentioned earlier, because a lot of it's what a guy's asked to do, what he was doing in his scheme versus what he's going to do at the NFL level. And a lot of times at those positions, the athleticism does matter. And we're still trying to sort through which positions in college guys can maybe get away with a little bit less athleticism and still be productive at the college level. Same thing with maybe height for cornerback, Sam. I think that we've run into that. There's a lot of cornerbacks that are in college that are a little bit smaller, that are just good tacklers. They blow up screens in college, which is huge. They accumulate a good grade, but then will they get exposed at the NFL level if they have to play a lot more man coverage and play against bigger, better receivers? So there's still a lot to look at, but again, I feel really good about where we are so far as looking into our data to help us project forward to the NFL. And we have a whole analytics team working hard on sorting through all of that right now.
I think we should wrap this with the most important question of the entire week, which is, if you were drafting an all-time roster right now, how early would you take your punter?
How many rounds are we going?
How many did it go? They went 20-odd rounds deep, enough to get a full set of starters on either side, plus special teams, plus a coach. So let's say 25 rounds.
He's number 25, Sam.
Number 25. So not number 4 overall.
Probably not number 4 overall, no. Position
Position
value matters here, right?
Oh, yeah. This is, you're starting a roster from scratch. You have available every player that's ever played in the history of the NFL. And Dan Fouts, anyway, decided that a punter was worth taking number 4 overall.
I probably wouldn't go that route.
No.
So I did see somebody mention it on Twitter. I think it was a very astute point. If it's a 12-person draft, you don't have to focus on quarterback as much. If it's a 32-person draft, it's much like fantasy. If you know you're going to get one of the top 12 quarterbacks of all time, you're probably going to be okay, even though it's the most important position. But the point was, because it's a 12-rounder, focus on, you can get your Lawrence Taylors, you can get your elite players, your cornerstone left tackle, whatever it might be. You can get your elite players early and still feel pretty good about your quarterback. There's still no logic for grabbing a punter just to make sure you get a couple extra yards of field position.
I'm fine with not taking a quarterback number 4 overall, but he took a punter above Reggie White.
I don't think he's going to have as big of an impact.
I don't either. And my favorite thing is he didn't just settle for that, as if that was his making a point thing. Taking Ray Guy, by the way. Dan Fouts took Ray Guy as the 4th player in the history of humanity that he would take if he was starting a franchise from scratch. He didn't just take a punter, number 4 overall. He doubled down and took a kicker in the 4th round. And then, for reasons that I've never managed to figure out, he then took a second punter later on in the draft. Which doesn't seem to make any sense to me. But
you never have too many punters, Sam.
I think you can. I think you can definitely have too many punters. Any more than one, you think you have too many punters.
Maybe he had it on auto draft.
Well, that's maybe what it was. Dan Fouts auto drafted the all-time draft, and he went special teams heavy.
The one excuse I almost kind of made was kind of like how we do the PFF 101 at the end of the season. We say, look, let's treat all positions equally. Let's try to make a point that this guy played left guard as well as Aaron Rodgers played quarterback, and put the left guard above him, and that's just how we do that. But that wasn't really the purpose of this exercise. So if he was just trying to make a point that, hey, Ray Guy is one of the best players of all time, that's one thing, but I don't know if that's the best way to make it.
Yeah. Also, I suspect he probably wasn't. There's a lot of mythology surrounding Ray Guy. That guy could punt the ball so far, a hang time, it would come back down after halftime. There's just like his there's only like one number that exists from Ray Guy, and that's gross average, which is a terrible, terrible way to rank punters because it doesn't tell you anything. It tells you where the ball ended up in relation to where he kicked it, which factors in 22 different people on that play.
Let's not kill history here, Sam. Just accept it. Ray Guy.
I'm just saying
his
he
awards
probably
named after
wasn't
him.
as good as the myth.
He's the greatest player of all time.
Yeah.
Hey, somebody asked about my pitching career. I thought that's the most important thing to finish on.
I just thought that was a joke, no?
Somebody really wants to know about my pitching career. And
No, I meant your pitching career.
Oh. Yeah, it's a bit of a joke. I'm doing football now. I think.
Go on, let's answer that one then.
Well, you could see you have my baseball card at home. You can look at the back and probably pick up some of my stats. I know you don't know what they mean or anything like that.
No, I don't. Hang on, I'm going to open this now. Look, this is the packet opening. This is costing me money right now.
Oh no, don't open it.
Well, I have to because there's another card thing obstructing the numbers.
Oh no, don't ruin the card. It's at least 75 cents now.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, it's going to go up in value. Has to. Appreciate.
Do a whole segment where Sam just reads Steve's stats.
What do we got here? In 2008, Palazzolo appeared in 23 games with Double-A Connecticut and posted a 3.56 ERA. That's how you say it, right? You go
3.56.
Damn
is
it.
the proper way to say it. Yeah.
I thought you got rid of the decimal.
No.
He also appeared in 6 games for the Grizzlies in 2008.
Oh no. The numbers are terrible.
Well, they don't give you those, so you're good.
So the 2008 season is the one that, as I get older, is going to be a lot more dramatic for my kids. It was the year that I was closest to the big leagues, and I was dominating in Double-A, got called up to Triple-A, and then the elbow started hurting. And I tried to valiantly pitch through injury because I knew that the big leagues were so close. Instead, I walked over one guy per inning and put up like a 10 ERA. Got put on the disabled list, got sent back to Double-A, and that's why that ERA is 3.5. It was actually about 2.3 when I got called up, but then the end of the season was just a disaster. But as I get older, I'll talk about how I got screwed and I should have been in the big leagues, but injury struck.
On this card, it lists some vital statistics. Height 6'10", weight 260. Are either of those numbers accurate?
Oh man, why you gotta put me on the spot like this?
I mean, at the time, not now.
Yeah, I may have shrunk since then. I think I'm closer to like 6'9" now. It's okay though. I'm still 6'10" in your program. 260 is now closer to 275. Though I've been working out hard in the Hornsby gym. And probably got down to about 270 before I hit vacation and just went crazy again and jumped back up to 275.
But it was a legit playing weight? Live Palazzolo was 260 at the time?
I'd say I was 260 maybe like probably 2 years earlier. By 2009, that card, I was probably closer to 270. That was my peak playing weight. My velocity was at its best at right around 270.
There we go. I think that concludes history for today.
Yeah, that's about it. We bored our readers with my career. Next week, we'll break down some of your Irish Football League game film, maybe, and that will...
Oh, there's some peachy highlights on YouTube right there.
Yeah, that'll
touchdown
be a perfect
catches.
Way. As long as it's better than what Ben showed me. He was a disaster. He was like minus 10 in a half of action. But,
well, the only highlights of me, I think, in existence are a touchdown catch and a big hit from safety, so I think I'm okay.
All right, so next week we'll break down Sam's YouTube highlights to really put our readers to sleep. If you guys want to hear any more, we try to get through the mailbag as much as we can. If you guys want to hear any more, hit us up on Twitter. I'm at PFF_Steve. He is at PFF_Sam. We'll try to answer your questions on Twitter as best we can. Don't forget about our great products. Sam, you want to run us through everything that's happening over on ProFootballFocus.com and our Edge and Elite products?
Well, that's it. We've broken out Edge and Elite. We've tried to simplify our offering. You know, anyone that's been with us for a while, trying to navigate the various products we were offering you the past couple of years was a significant challenge. So we tried to make it a hell of a lot easier. If you just want your simple player grades, your fantasy rankings, projections, that kind of thing, PFF Edge is the thing for you. It's $39.99 for the year. You also get year-round NFL draft coverage with Steve's Draft Pass, which is out already for looking ahead for the season to come. that is our entry-level package and more than worth the $39.99. If, however, you are a big fan of old-school PFF data, the signature stats are back. Signature stats are in PFF Elite, so that's a $199.99 value, but it's actually significantly more than that kind of value because you get old-school premium stats, SIG stats back. You get DFS lineup optimizer powered by PFF projections. You get game-by-game data on where every player lined up with a position pivot tool. That's pretty cool. All sorts of stuff. So we've simplified our offer and given you some cool stuff back.
Be sure to check out Edge and Elite. Sam did a great job of summing that up. Check out the PFF archive. We're going 2 times a week. We'll be doing the same during the season. Appreciate all of your feedback. Be sure to go ahead and leave a 5-star review at iTunes. And that's about it for this week. We'll see you guys next time.